In the spring of 1987, in the fruit belt of western Michigan near the shore of Lake Michigan, a hard freeze could turn a blooming orchard to glass overnight, every blossom coated in ice, brittle and doomed, and every grower in Allegan County had learned to fear the sky more than the bank. That spring belonged to Orville Mercer, 41 years old, who worked 40 acres of Jonathan and red delicious apple trees his father had planted in the years after the war. The wrong belief that ruled every orchard for 50 miles in any direction was simple and unshakable. An apple tree survived on sunlight, full and unbroken, and anything that dimmed that sunlight, anything that came between the leaf and the sky, was a threat to the crop and to the man who grew it. Growers sprayed their trees with sulfur and lime for scab, with lead arsenate in the old days and organophosphates now, but always the goal was the same, to keep the leaf clean and the light open. Because light meant sugar, and sugar meant a fat harvest of fancy-grade fruit worth $6 to $8 a bushel at the Fenville Cooperative that summer. Orville had grown up believing that as much as any man on the Ridge Road, he had picked apples under a blistering July sun as a boy, watched his father wipe his neck with a red handkerchief and say that the sun was the orchard's whole fortune, and he had never once questioned it until the summer his own trees began scalding. Sunburn had crept into his red delicious block 2 years running, the west-facing fruit blistering brown and leathery on one cheek, while the rest of the apples stayed hard and green, and no grade above utility waited for a scalded apple no matter how sweet its flesh. He had read, in a dog-eared agricultural extension bulletin passed to him by a county agent named Vera Holcomb, about a strange experiment out of a research station in the south-central plains, where a fine white mineral dust, calcined kaolin clay, had been sprayed onto tomato plants, baking in a drought, and had somehow cooled them and protected them without blocking the light the way every man in the county assumed it must. Orville read that bulletin 3 times at his kitchen table with the lamp burning past midnight, and by the time he set it down he had a plan that violated everything a fruitman in Allegan County had ever been taught to believe about sunlight and survival. The question he carried out to the barn that night, turning it over the way a man turns over a stone he isn't sure is safe to lift, was whether an orchard could be saved not by keeping the sun in, but by learning, for the first time in his life, how to keep it out. Orville Mercer was not a reckless man, and that was precisely what made his neighbors so certain something had finally cracked in him when word got around that he'd ordered 400 pounds of powdered kaolin clay from a ceramic supplier in Grand Rapids, the same soft white mineral used for pottery glaze and fine china, and meant to spray every one of his 18,000 trees with it. The man who spread that word fastest and loudest was Talbot Nash, who ran the biggest orchard on the Ridge Road at 96 acres and sat on the board of the Fenville Growers Cooperative. Man who had never in 22 years missed a chance to remind Orville, whose family had really built the fruit business in that township. Talbot stood at the co-op counter that April with a crate of grafting stock under one arm and told anyone who'd listen that Orville Mercer had gone and bought himself 400 pounds of pottery dust to paint his apple trees white, like a man trying to turn his orchard into a graveyard, full of headstones before the trees were even dead. The men around the counter laughed the way men laugh when they are relieved. The joke is happening to someone else. And by the following week the story had grown a code of its own, that Orville was spraying his trees with plaster, with chalk, with lime slurry so thick the leaves would suffocate under it by June. Only one man at that counter didn't laugh. Wendell Krause, who farmed 60 acres 2 miles south and had known Orville since they were boys hauling bushel baskets for their fathers, walked out to Orville's place that same evening, and found him in the barn, measuring clay into a 50-gallon drum with a coffee can, working out the ratio by lamplight, 50 pounds of kaolin to 100 gallons of water with a splash of liquid soap to help it stick to the waxy leaf surface. Wendell didn't ask if Orville had lost his mind, because he could see plainly enough that Orville hadn't slept much and didn't much care what the co-op counter thought of him. What Wendell asked instead was how many gallons an acre would take, and whether the old air blast sprayer Orville's father had bought second-hand in 1961 could even push a clay slurry that thick through its nozzles without clogging solid by the second row. That question, more than any word of comfort, was the first sign Orville had that he wasn't going to face that summer entirely alone, even if half the township had already decided he was ruined. Wendell stayed in the barn past 11 that night, turning a coffee can of the pale mineral over in his palm, rubbing a pinch of it between two fingers the way a man tests flour, and told Orville it felt nothing like the lime or sulfur dust either of them had ever handled. Softer, almost silky. Orville admitted the order had cost him just under $60, small money against a mortgage note, but real money against a household budget already stretched thin by 2 years of sunburn losses. And Wendell only said that $60 spent finding out was cheaper than another summer spent not knowing. Getting 400 pounds of pottery clay to behave like an agricultural spray took Orville and Wendell the better part of 3 weeks that April, because nothing about the old air blast rig was built for a mineral slurry, and every mistake cost them a clogged nozzle, a stripped gasket, or an afternoon spent flushing gray sludge out of a 50-gallon tank meant for thin liquid fungicide. Orville's sprayer was a 1961 Friday tractor-mounted unit with a 200-gallon tank and a rear fan that threw a fine mist 30 feet into the canopy, more than adequate for sulfur and copper. But the kaolin settled out of suspension within minutes if the agitator paddle stopped turning even once, and a settled clay would pack itself into the screen filter like mortar. Wendell, who had a knack for machinery that Orville had always envied, rebuilt the agitator with a second paddle welded in at an angle to keep the slurry circulating, even at idle speed. And the two men rigged a mesh pre-filter from window screening to catch the coarser clay particles before they ever reached the pump. They tested ratios on 4 rows at the north end of the orchard first, a 50-pound per 100-gallon mix that came out too thin and dried into a patchy gray film that washed off in the first rain, and then a mix twice as heavy that clogged the nozzles within a single pass. It took them until the first week of May, working most evenings after their regular chores, to settle on 62 pounds of kaolin per 100 gallons with 4 ounces of liquid soap as a spreader sticker, a mix that went on as a thin white milk and dried within 2 hours into a fine, even, chalky coat that clung to the leaf and the fruit alike without cracking or flaking away. Orville kept a notebook, the same kind of dime store composition book his father had used to track spray dates and rainfall for 30 years, and in it he wrote down every ratio, every nozzle pressure, every hour of drying time, because he understood, even that first spring, that if this worked, he would need to prove exactly how, and if it failed, he would need to know exactly why. By the 3rd week of May, the whole 18,000 trees stood coated head to root in a fine white film. The orchard changed overnight from green to a pale, ghostly gray-white that could be seen from the county road a half-mile off, and it was that sight, more than anything Talbot Nash had said at the co-op counter, that turned Orville Mercer's orchard into the talk of the township. The composition book became a fixture on the kitchen table that spring, its pages ruled into columns for the date, the mix ratio, the tank pressure, and a last column marked simply held or washed, depending on whether the coat had survived the day's weather. Wendell teased him that he kept better records on his apple trees than the courthouse kept on its deeds, and Orville answered that a deed only had to be right once, while a spray schedule had to be right every 10 days all summer, or the whole gamble came apart in a single missed rain. The skill in spraying kaolin clay correctly, Orville learned that first season, had almost nothing in common with spraying a fungicide, because a fungicide only needed to reach the leaf, while a particle film needed to cover every surface of the fruit itself, evenly, on all sides, without leaving a bare patch where the July sun could still find bare green skin and scald it. He and Wendell drove the rows at a slower pace than usual, closer to 2 miles an hour instead of the usual 3.5, letting the air blast fan work its way fully around each tree rather than simply passing by it, and they learned to spray in the cool of early morning before 7 o'clock, when the air was still and the mist could settle onto the leaf rather than drift off on a breeze and waste half the tank on the grass between the rows. Orville figured out through trial that the clay needed reapplication roughly every 10 to 14 days through the hottest stretch of summer, more often if a hard rain washed a fresh coat away, and that a light second coat over an already dry first coat built a stronger film than trying to lay down one heavy pass all at once. He watched, too, for something he hadn't expected from the bulletin at all, which was how the coated leaves felt different under his palm within days, dry and slightly rough instead of smooth and waxy, and how the apple maggot flies that usually swarmed the orchard by the hundreds in late June seemed to land on a coated branch, struggle against the fine dust clinging to their legs and wings, and leave without settling to lay eggs in the fruit the way they always had before. Vera Holcomb, the county extension agent who had first handed Orville that bulletin, drove out twice in June to walk the rows with him, taking notes of her own on a clipboard, measuring leaf surface temperature with a small handheld thermometer, and finding it read 8 to 10 degrees cooler on a coated leaf than on a bare one under the same noon sun. She told Orville plainly that she'd never seen a Michigan grower attempt kaolin at this scale, that the research so far had mostly stayed in test plots and university orchards, and that whatever happened that summer, good or bad, the Extension office wanted a full record of it. Orville kept spraying, kept writing in his composition book, and kept ignoring the sound of cars slowing down on the county road to look at his pale, dust-white orchard the way people slow down to look at a barn fire. He learned, too, that timing mattered around the rented hives of honeybees working the May blossoms, since a fresh coat of clay could gum a bee's wings, the same way it fouled a maggot fly's footing. So Orville pushed his first heavy application to the week after petal fall. Once the bees had moved on to a neighbor's clover field, and never sprayed a drop before then in any season that followed. By the middle of June, the whole township had settled into 2 camps, and there wasn't much middle ground between them. In one camp stood the men who'd farmed the Ridge Road all their lives and swore that Orville Mercer had thrown away a season's income on pottery dust, a group that grew louder every week with Talbot Nash near its center, telling anyone at the co-op or the feed store or the Grange Hall that Orville's trees looked half dead already, gray and ghostly, and that a man who couldn't tell the difference between a healthy orchard and a haunted one had no business running 90 acres. Let alone 40. In the other camp stood a much smaller handful, Wendell Krause chief among them, along with Vera Holcomb, and, more quietly than either of them, livestock and produce auctioneer named Roscoe Piedmont, who ran the weighing scales at the Fenville Co-op and had a habit of walking his own rounds through member orchards each summer to get an early read on the harvest to come. Roscoe said little in public that June, but he stopped his truck at the end of Orville's Lane twice that month, walked a few rows in his shirt sleeves, and each time wrote something down in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket without telling Orville what it was. The apples themselves, meanwhile, were doing something Orville hadn't fully dared to hope for. By June's end, with 3 coats of kaolin laid down and reapplied after each rain, the red delicious block that had scalded badly the 2 summers before showed no sign of blister anywhere on its west-facing rows, the fruit sizing up round and firm under its dusty white coat, and the leaf canopy, rather than suffocating as every man on the Ridge Road had predicted, was pushing new growth as vigorously as any unsprayed tree in the county. Temperatures that June had already touched 94 degrees on 3 separate afternoons, hot enough that the older men were predicting a rough sunburn year, even for orchards that had never scalded before, and rough enough that a Cortland block 2 farms over lost nearly a fifth of its fruit to blister in a single blistering week. Orville wrote the 94-degree readings into his composition book beside a column of leaf temperatures Vera had measured for him. 84 degrees on the coated leaves that same afternoon, a full 10 degrees cooler. And beneath those numbers he wrote nothing at all, because for the first time since April he didn't feel any need to defend himself to anyone. Roscoe's second visit that month came unannounced, and he spent nearly an hour walking the red delicious rows, turning fruit over in his hand and pressing a thumbnail lightly against the skin, before finally telling Orville he'd been grading Allegan County apples for 19 years and had never once seen a block this clean going into the hottest stretch of a Michigan summer. Orville thanked him and said nothing more, mindful that the man's job depended on staying neutral until the fruit itself, and not any grower's opinion, had earned its grade at the scale. July arrived with the driest, hottest stretch western Michigan had seen in 9 years, the kind of summer old-timers at the Grange Hall would still be talking about a decade later. 3 straight weeks without a drop of rain and daytime highs that broke 95 degrees on 11 separate afternoons, baking the Ridge Road orchards under a sun that seemed to sit directly overhead from 10 in the morning until 6 at night. Talbot Nash's 96 acres, unprotected and unshaded, took the worst of it, his Red Delicious and Jonathan blocks alike, showing sunburn on nearly every west-facing row by the 3rd week of July, the fruit blistering brown and cracking along the shoulder where the skin split under the heat. And beneath the scalded fruit, the coddling moth and apple maggot populations exploded in numbers nobody in the county had seen since the early 70s, feeding on stressed, weakened trees that had nothing left to fight them off with. Orville's orchard, by contrast, sailed through the heat wave with barely a blemish, the kaolin film reflecting so much of the punishing July sun that his fruit stayed cool enough to avoid scalding almost entirely, and the fine white dust that coated every leaf and stem continued to foul the footing and the egg-laying instincts of the insects that tried to land there, so that his maggot counts, when Vera Holcomb came out with her monitoring traps in the last week of July, ran at barely a tenth of what she was finding in unprotected orchards 2 and 3 farms away. Talbot Nash did not take the comparison quietly. At a co-op board meeting in the last days of July, with harvest only weeks away and half the Ridge Road orchards showing real crop damage, Talbot stood up and argued that Orville's kaolin-coated apples, whatever they looked like on the tree, would never pass the co-op's grading standards for market. That buyers wanted a clean red apple with a natural shine, not fruit that had to be scrubbed and polished free of a chalky white residue before it could even be inspected, and he pushed, with 2 other board members behind him, for a rule requiring any kaolin-treated fruit to be washed and re-inspected at the grower's own expense before the co-op would accept a single bushel of it. The board tabled the proposal for a vote in August, which meant Orville spent the first 2 weeks of that month not knowing whether the very cooperative his father had helped found in 1952 would even agree to buy the harvest he had spent the whole summer protecting. Wendell's own 30 acres, planted mostly to Jonathan's, and left unsprayed that year since he'd wanted a clean comparison to weigh against Orville's results, came through the heat wave with scald across nearly a quarter of the crop, a loss Wendell took in stride, telling Orville over the fence line one evening that watching his own trees blister that July had taught him more in 6 weeks than any extension pamphlet ever had, and that he intended to order his own 400 pounds of kaolin from the Grand Rapids supplier before the following spring, regardless of what the co-op decided to do with Orville's harvest. The crisis, when it finally landed, came from 2 directions at once, and Orville felt both of them close together in the second week of August. The first was financial. His note at the Fenville Farmers Bank, $4,200 borrowed that spring against the promise of a normal harvest, came due for its interest payment on the 15th of August, and the loan officer, cautious man named Delbert Ray, who had heard every rumor Talbot Nash had spread since April, told Orville plainly across his desk that the bank had been fielding questions from other co-op members about whether Mercer orchard fruit would even be marketable that fall, given the washing and re-inspection rule still pending a board vote. Delbert didn't call the note, not yet, but he made clear that a bad vote at the co-op in 2 weeks' time could change that fast. The second direction the crisis came from was the co-op board itself, where Talbot Nash, sensing his own damaged crop losing value by the day, had grown more aggressive rather than less, telling fellow board members in the days before the August vote that approving kaolin-coated fruit without restriction would open the co-op to buyer complaints and depress prices for every clean-picked apple in the warehouse, including, though he never said it outright, his own storm-damaged and sunburned harvest that badly needed every cent of market price it could still fetch. Roscoe Piedmont, who had walked Orville's rows twice in June and kept his own counsel through the whole summer, finally spoke up at that August board meeting, standing at the front of the co-op hall with his small notebook in hand and reading off numbers he had recorded himself on his summer rounds. Sunburn incidents under 1% on Mercer's 40 acres against sunburn incidents running as high as 31% on several unprotected orchards on the Ridge Road, including, Roscoe noted without raising his voice, Nash orchards. Talbot's own crop, in other words, had become the clearest evidence in the room for exactly the outcome he was trying to argue against, and the co-op board, faced with an independent weighmaster's numbers instead of township gossip, voted 6-2 to accept kaolin-coated fruit at standard grading after a routine wash, the same wash every apple in the warehouse already went through before packing. Delbert Ray heard about the vote before Orville had a chance to tell him, since the bank's own president sat on the co-op board and had been in the hall that night, and when Orville came in 3 days later to make his August interest payment, Delbert slid the receipt across the desk without a word about the washing rule or the rumors that had filled his office all spring, only asking in the flat, businesslike tone he used for every borrower whether Orville expected harvest to run early or on schedule that year. Question Orville answered honestly, telling him the fruit looked 10 days ahead of where it usually sat by mid-August. The reversal was not loud when it came, and Orville Mercer never once stood up at the co-op hall to gloat over the vote or over Talbot Nash's ruined crop, because by the 3rd week of August there was nothing left to argue about that the fruit itself hadn't already settled. Harvest began on Orville's 40 acres on the 24th of August, 3 days ahead of his usual schedule, because the kaolin-protected apples had sized and colored evenly all season without the stress checks that normally slowed a Michigan apple's final ripening in a hot year. And when the first bushel crates rolled off the washing line at the co-op, the fine white kaolin residue rinsing away in seconds under the standard spray wash every grower's fruit went through. What came out the other side was red delicious and Jonathan apples with a deep, even color and a skin almost entirely free of blemish, scald, or insect-scarring fruit that graded out at nearly 91% fancy or better, a figure Roscoe Piedmont read aloud at the scale house that Orville had never come close to touching in 9 previous harvests. Talbot Nash's harvest told the opposite story. His 96 acres picked the following week, graded barely 58% fancy, with entire bins of scalded, cracked, and maggot-damaged fruit, sorted down to utility and cider grade, worth a fraction of the price his fancy apples would have brought. And word around the scale house that September was that Talbot's own banknote, larger than Orville's by a wide margin given the size of his operation, had come due at nearly the same moment his crop value collapsed. Vera Holcomb, writing up her season's field notes for the extension office that fall, recorded the comparison plainly that the Mercer Orchard's kaolin clay film had reduced sunburn incidence by better than 96% and cut insect damage by roughly 2/3 against neighboring unprotected blocks in the same growing season under the same weather. Numbers she would submit to the regional office in Lansing that winter, as the first documented large-scale grower trial of its kind in the state of Michigan. Orville read her draft report at his kitchen table one October evening, the same table where he had first read the bulletin about tomatoes in a southern drought 7 months earlier, and he found that the wrong belief he had carried his whole life, that an orchard survived only by keeping the sun in close and unbroken, had turned out to be the very thing that nearly ruined him and every man on the Ridge Road who had clung to it a season too long. Roscoe Piedmont's final scale house tally for the season, posted on the co-op bulletin board the first week of September the way it was every year, listed Mercer orchard fruit at the top of the fancy grade column for the first time in the 9 harvests. Orville had brought apples through that scale house. Single-typed line that drew more traffic past the bulletin board that week than any co-op notice Roscoe could remember posting in a long while. The payoff arrived that October in a form far more ordinary than Orville had expected, which was, he thought later, exactly how the truest payoffs usually arrived, not as a single triumphant moment, but as a season's worth of numbers stacking up on paper, until even the men who had mocked him could no longer argue with the ledger. The Fenville Co-op's final settlement that fall paid Orville just over $11,000 for a 40-acre crop, that in a bad sunburn year might have brought him barely $4,000, and he paid off Delbert Ray's note in full on the 12th of November, with 2 months to spare. Fact Delbert mentioned without any apparent embarrassment the next time Orville came into the bank, as if the whole spring's worth of cautious questions had simply been forgotten. Talbot Nash's ledger told a harder story, and by January it was common knowledge on the Ridge Road that he had sold off nearly a third of his equipment, including a nearly new grain truck, to cover a shortfall the bank had stopped extending credit against after his poor harvest, and that the same board seat he had held for 11 years was quietly filled by someone else at the co-op's spring meeting. A change nobody on the board needed to explain out loud because everyone in the hall already understood the arithmetic behind it. What surprised Orville more than any of that, though, was the knock on his door in February from Talbot Nash himself, standing on the porch in a canvas coat with his hat in his hands, asking, without much ceremony and without quite managing to look Orville in the eye, whether Orville would walk him through the kaolin mixture and the sprayer modifications before spring planting season, because he intended to try it on his own 96 acres that coming summer whether the rest of the Ridge Road laughed at him for it or not. Orville poured 2 cups of coffee, pulled out the same composition book he had kept since April of the year before, and spent the better part of 2 hours walking Talbot through every ratio, every nozzle setting, every lesson Wendell Krause had helped him learn the hard way. Because it had never once occurred to Orville, even at the worst of that August board fight, that the man's downfall was something to savor rather than something to simply let the harvest itself explain. Talbot lingered at the door afterward, turning his hat over once in his hands, and admitted, in a voice much quieter than the one he'd used at the co-op counter the previous April, that he'd told half the township Orville was painting his orchard into a graveyard, and that he supposed a man ought to say as much to the fellow he'd said it about, rather than let it sit unspoken between 2 neighbors who'd share a property line for another 30 years. Orville only refilled both coffee cups and told him the mixture worked the same, whether a man believed in it or not, which seemed to settle whatever else either of them might have said about that spring. By the time Orville Mercer's orchard came into its 5th kaolin-protected season in the early 1990s, the pale, dust-white rose that had once drawn slowing cars and township gossip down the county road had become such an ordinary sight on the Ridge Road that a stranger passing through might have assumed every apple orchard in Allegan County had always looked that way, coated white against the summer sun. Vera Holcomb's field reports filed with the State Extension Office that first winter had circulated further than she or Orville ever expected, cited in grower newsletters, as far off as the Grand Rapids Fruit Belt and the Traverse City Cherry Country. And by 1993 other orchards on the Ridge Road, Talbot Nash's among them, were running their own air blast sprayers loaded with the same clay slurry Orville had mixed alone in a barn by lamplight 3 years earlier. Wendell Krause's welded agitator paddle, the small, unglamorous fix that had kept that first batch of clay in suspension long enough to save a season, became something close to a standard modification among the growers who adopted the method. And Roscoe Piedmont kept weighing and grading fruit at the co-op scale house for another decade, telling newer growers who asked about the white-coated trees on the Mercer place that he'd watched the numbers with his own eyes back in that brutal summer of 1987, and had never once doubted them since. Orville himself never spoke of that season as a triumph over Talbot Nash or over anyone else on the Ridge Road, and when younger growers asked him years later what had made him try something so strange with money he could barely spare, he told them the same thing every time, that his father had taught him an orchard's whole fortune lay in the sun, and that it had taken a single scalding summer to teach him the rest of it. That a wise man learns not just to welcome the sun, but to know exactly how much of it a living thing can bear before it turns from a blessing into a wound. The ghost-white orchard that had once been the whole township's punchline stood, by the time Orville was an old man walking those same 40 acres with a cane, as the plainest kind of proof he knew of that the things a man's neighbors laugh at hardest are sometimes the very things that end up feeding them. His composition books, 7 of them by the time his knees finally kept him off the ladder for good, sat on a shelf in the same barn where he'd first measured clay into a 50-gallon drum by lamplight, and more than one visiting extension agent over the years asked to photograph their pages. Ratios and rainfall and grading percentages in a dead man's steady handwriting, long after the pale white orchard on the Ridge Road had stopped being anything worth slowing a car down to look at and had simply become, at last, what a well-run Michigan orchard was supposed to look like every August.